Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos is a historian, journalist, and author joining us from London. We also have Brent Yonkers, author and historian, who joins us from Hasselt. Okay, first to you, Dr. Papadopoulos. When you take a look at Israel, this piece of news, why is it that they are expanding their Dimona nuclear facility, and why is it that they don't allow any inspections of their facilities?
Well, the findings of these experts are disconcerting, but not surprising. I say disconcerting because the Middle East is, after all, the most volatile region in the world. And it is hardly in the interests of the region, for the safety and well-being of the population in this region, for a country, in this case Israel, to be expanding its nuclear capabilities. And I say unsurprising because Israel historically acts with impunity. The Israeli state was allowed to develop nuclear weapons. The Israeli state has been allowed to expand its nuclear capabilities. The Israelis are not signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it is on that basis why Israel constitutes a very grave source of instability in the Middle East. The Israelis have the audacity to argue, both at home and abroad, for example at the United Nations, that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. I say it is simply just the audacity of the Israelis to argue that, because Israel has nuclear weapons, and Iran has made it very clear that it uses nuclear power for civilian peaceful purposes only. Yet if Iran was accused of developing nuclear weapons, which of course the Israelis, the Americans and the British have claimed on numerous occasions in the past, the world would be up in arms about it. But at the same time, the world is perfectly content to not only allow Israel to have nuclear weapons, but also to allow the Israelis to develop nuclear weapons. So it is a very, very grave situation. But as I said moments ago, it is not surprising. And of course, it is in the interests of America and Britain for Israel to have nuclear weapons. Why? Because Israel is a conduit for American and British power in the Middle East. America and Britain are the outside dominant forces in the Middle East. And without the Israeli conduit, America and Britain would not be able to have the influence and power, the predominance which it has in the Middle East. And therefore, the ultimate protection for the American and British conduit is to allow Israel not only to keep its nuclear weapons, but to expand its nuclear weapon capabilities.
Back in 2018, Brent Yonkers, Israel threatened Iran with nuclear action. You've had what our guest there said, no inspections being allowed, nor is Israel a member of the NPT. You also have Saudi Arabia that has a program that does not allow any inspections, a nuclear program. But at the same time, you have the U.S. and its allies who have concentrated and zoomed in on Iran and its civilian nuclear program. Iran, which has promoted time and again a Middle East or West Asia free of nuclear weapons. Why the double standards there when it comes to Iran?
Well, I think it's a very clear clear-cut case of hypocrisy, and this is something that has happened over and over again in multiple different occasions. So every time we're talking about, for example, the accusations of Iran supporting outside forces, of Iran sending militias, of Iran backing up what they call rogue governments, these are all forms of projection. These are all accusations accusing Iran of doing things that the West and the Israelis have been doing for decades, backing backing terrorist organizations, for example, in the war against Syria, invading countries like they did in Libya, like they did in Iraq. These are all things that the West has been doing over and over again. And the same thing goes for this nuclear weapon policy. They accuse Iran of having a plan to develop nuclear weapons, which, even if it were true, it's a different matter entirely. Even if it were true, that would not be more dangerous or more serious than a country like Israel or India or Pakistan developing nuclear weapons, all of which have developed such weaponry in the past and still maintain a stockpile right now. But on top of all that, they have absolutely no evidence of the fact that of the claim, let's say, that Iran would have nuclear weapons, whereas there is tons of evidence stating that Israel, at the very least, has developed 90 nuclear warheads and possibly up to 200. We know this. This is what we call a public secret. Let's say it's not officially admitted, not officially confirmed by the Zionist entity, but it's also not denied either. And when you look at the even Western mainstream media talking about the Dimona nuclear research facility, newspapers such as The Guardian also have no problem. This is mainstream British media. They have no problem saying Israel has developed nuclear weapons here, is still developing nuclear weapons, and likely is going to build more. This is mainstream media in the West basically blatantly admitting that this is happening. But the problem is there is no action being done against this, despite the fact that Israel is one of the worst offenders of humanitarian rights in general, of international human law, and of course also of every single rule worldwide regarding nuclear weapons. The Israelis have been selling nuclear secrets to apartheid South Africa back before apartheid fell in the early 1990s. In fact, we know that the apartheid regime in South Africa had 6 nuclear weapons prior to 1989, after which they dismantled and destroyed them because they didn't want, let's say, the majority black population to have access to these. And these nuclear weapons have already been proven beyond any reasonable doubt to, for a big part, come from Israel. At least the technology, the know-how came from the Zionist entity. And there is a whole amount of other evidence. For example, the nuclear scientist Mordechai Vanunu, who spent 18 years in jail for revealing the secrets, for whistleblowing on the Israeli nuclear program. So the fact that all of this happens shows that we know this nuclear program exists. But the reason why nothing is being done against it and why the focus is being put on Iran is, as with so many other things, unfortunately, in geopolitics, is hypocrisy, Western hypocrisy, imperialist hypocrisy, trying to project their sins and their crimes on nations that stand in the way of their hegemonic plans.
Well, if I'm any type of association looking at Israel, Dr. Papadopoulos, whether it's an arms control treaty type organization or even any country, I'm looking at Israel that has bombed Syria about 50 times this past year. I'm looking at an Israel that is breaking all types of laws when it comes to the occupied Palestinian territories, that has been aggressive in nature, backed by the U.S., who has been involved in the war in Syria also. And now the idea of Israel expanding its Dimona nuclear facility, that again, you mentioned about 100 or 200 warheads. Some have put that at 300 or even more. I would be very concerned. Shouldn't there be any action taken at the UN to discuss this?
Naturally, Israel is, in my estimation, an exceptionally grave threat to peace and stability in the Middle East, or whatever is left of peace and stability in the Middle East. The argument, the rationale of the Israeli government for invading Lebanon, for interfering, violating Syrian independence and sovereignty is, quote, self-defense. Well, that is a ludicrous argument, and it has no leg to stand on under international law. Because if every country in the world adopted that line of argument, that we are going to invade a bordering country in order to defend ourselves, then the world would be witness to untold numbers of wars occurring, not on a yearly basis, but on a monthly basis. The problem, as I said, is that Israel acts with impunity. Israel has a blank check, so to speak, from Washington and London, and it has done ever since its creation. The Americans and the British understand, as I said moments ago, that ultimately it's their predominance in the Middle East rests with Israel. Israel is the conduit for American and British predominance in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is also a conduit for American and British influence and power in the Middle East, but Israel is the main one. And I'm glad that the other guest made reference to British mainstream media, and in particular the hideous Guardian newspaper. British mainstream media on a regular basis is hysterical about Iran developing weapons of mass destruction. Yet British mainstream media says nothing about not only Israel expanding its nuclear capabilities, but the very fact that Israel unofficially has nuclear weapons. And the Guardian newspaper, in my opinion, is the most repulsive of all the newspapers in Britain, because the Guardian, like all other national newspapers in Britain, is neither free nor independent nor credible. Leading up to Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Britain a few years ago, the Guardian newspaper, which purports to be a defender of human rights, ran numerous advertisements in one of its editions, which brought in a vast amount of money from The Guardian. So The Guardian doesn't care about human rights. The Guardian doesn't care about the Middle East and the well-being of the ordinary person in the Middle East. No, The Guardian is simply another newspaper in Britain, which is part of the British establishment.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, journalist, and author. Thank you, Brett Yonkers, author and historian. And that does it for the news review. Thanks for tuning in.